The building was enormous. It was made of glass and steel, towering high above the city's streets. Inside, the air was always cool and smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning products. Thousands of people worked here. They wore suits and ties. They carried expensive briefcases. They walked very fast, always looking at their phones or their watches. They were important people with important jobs. They had meetings to attend and deals to close. Then there was Arthur. Arthur was not important. At least, that is what he believed. He was 62 years old. He had worked in this same building for 20 years. He did not wear a suit. He wore a light gray cardigan that had seen better days. Underneath, he wore simple button-down shirts, usually blue or white. His hair was thinning and gray. He wore glasses that slid down his nose a little bit, and he constantly pushed them back up. Arthur worked in the mailroom. It was located in the basement, away from the windows and the natural light. It was a quiet place filled with the sound of paper being shuffled and the hum of large machines. His job was to sort the letters and packages. He knew exactly where everything needed to go. He knew the name of every person in the company, from the big boss at the top to the interns at the bottom. But they did not know him. To them, he was just part of the background. He was like a chair or a desk. He was there, but he wasn't really seen. He liked it that way. Arthur was a shy man. He didn't like crowds. He didn't like loud noises. He felt safe in the basement with his stacks of envelopes. He ate his lunch alone every day. He would sit on a bench in the small park outside. But he would sit at the very end, hoping no one would choose the spot next to him. He was invisible and he was content. One Tuesday afternoon, the atmosphere on the main floor was chaotic. The company was preparing for its annual family day. It was a big event. There would be food and games. Most importantly, there was a talent show. Anyone could sign up to sing, dance, or tell jokes. It was supposed to be fun, a way for the employees to relax. However, there was a problem. The event planner, a young woman named Jessica, was stressed out. She stood near the large glass entrance to the cafeteria, holding a clipboard. Her hair was a mess, and she looked like she might cry. "We are short one act," she said to a group of her colleagues. "We need 20 people for the show to balance the time slots. We only have 19. The schedule looks empty in the middle." Her friends tried to help. "Maybe someone from accounting can do a magic trick?" one suggested. "Counting is busy," Jessica sighed. "I have asked everyone. I am out of options." Just then, the elevator doors dinged. Arthur stepped out. He was pushing a heavy cart full of express packages. He was on his way to the executive offices on the top floor. He tried to move quickly along the edge of the wall, so he wouldn't be in the way. Jessica looked up. She saw the gray cardigan. She saw the familiar face. She had seen him 1,000 times but never spoke a word to him. She didn't even know his name. To her, he was just the mail guy. An idea popped into her head. It wasn't a mean idea, but it was a thoughtless one. She saw the old piano sitting in the corner of the lobby. It was a beautiful instrument, but it was mostly used as a shelf for flower pots. No one had played it in years. "Hey," Jessica called out. She waved her hand. "You." "The mailman." Arthur stopped. He looked around, thinking she was signaling someone behind him. Seeing no one, he pointed a thumb at his own chest. "Me, yes. You," Jessica said. She walked over to him, her heels clicking loudly on the floor. "You know how to play that piano, don't you?" Arthur blinked. He looked at the piano in the corner. It was covered in a thin layer of dust. He looked back at Jessica. His heart gave a small, nervous flutter. "No," Arthur said softly. "I just sort the mail." "Come on," Jessica laughed. It was a friendly laugh, but it was loud. It made Arthur shrink back a bit. Everyone can play a little bit. Chopsticks, right? Or heart and soul. Come on, we are desperate. We need one more act for the talent show. It would be funny. It would be great. The other people standing around nodded. "Yeah, give it a try," one man said. "It's all for fun." Arthur looked at their faces. They were smiling. They were expecting him to say yes. They thought it would be a hilarious bit, the quiet male guy playing a silly song. He felt trapped. If he said no, he would be the grumpy old man who ruined the fun. If he said yes, he would make a fool of himself. He opened his mouth to say no. He wanted to tell them that he didn't know funny songs. He wanted to tell them that music wasn't a joke to him. But the words stuck in his throat. The pressure of their stares was too heavy. He was a man who spent his life trying not to cause trouble. He was a man who said yes so people would leave him alone. "Okay," Arthur whispered. "What was that?" Jessica asked, leaning in. "Okay," Arthur said, a little louder. Jessica clapped her hands together, delighted. "Perfect. You're on the list. The show is on Friday at 4 p.m. Don't be late." She scribbled something on her clipboard and walked away, already shouting orders at someone else. The crowd dispersed. The lobby went back to its busy, noisy self. Arthur stood there by his cart. His hands were shaking slightly. He gripped the handle of the cart tight to stop them. He felt a knot form in his stomach. He looked over at the piano again. It sat there silently, mocking him. He pushed the cart toward the elevator. As the doors closed, he caught his reflection in the shiny metal walls. He looked tired. He looked small. "What have I done?" he thought to himself. For the rest of the day, Arthur couldn't focus. He dropped a stack of envelopes. He put a package in the wrong bin. The younger workers in the mailroom noticed something was wrong. "Everything all right, Arthur?" a young man named Tim asked. Arthur nodded quickly. "Fine. Just fine." He didn't tell them about the show. He couldn't. He was embarrassed. He knew they would laugh. He knew he wasn't a performer. He was just Arthur. When his shift ended, Arthur didn't go home right away. He walked through the empty hallways of the main floor. Most of the lights had been dimmed for the night. The cleaning crew was buzzing around with vacuums. Arthur made his way to the lobby. The piano sat alone in the dim light. The flower pots were still on top of it. Arthur looked around to make sure no one was watching. He carefully lifted the heavy ceramic pots and set them on the floor. Then he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the thick layer of dust off the keys. He sat down on the bench. It was hard and cold. He stared at the black and white keys. They looked like teeth. He took off his jacket and laid it on the bench next to him. He rolled up his sleeves. Slowly, hesitantly, Arthur reached out with his right hand. He pressed down a single key. A deep, low note filled the empty lobby. The sound was rich and clear. He pressed another key. Then another. It had been 30 years since he had touched a piano. 30 years since he had sat in his living room with his wife, playing while she sang. That life felt like a dream now. She was gone. The house was sold. The piano had been sold. All he had left were the memories, and those were painful. He placed both hands on the keys. He didn't know what he was going to play. He just wanted to feel the vibration under his fingers. He took a deep breath. His hands began to move. At first, they were stiff and rusty. The notes came out slow and disconnected. But then, his muscle memory took over. His fingers found the familiar patterns. A melody began to emerge. It was not chopsticks. It was not a joke. It was a complex, sad, and beautiful piece of music that he had learned as a boy. Arthur closed his eyes. He forgot he was in the office lobby. He forgot he was the mailroom clerk. He played with his heart. The music filled the vast space, swirling around the marble floors. He played for 10 minutes. He didn't care if anyone heard him. He was playing for the ghost of his past. When he finally stopped, the silence rushed back in, louder than before. Arthur opened his eyes. He looked at his trembling hands. He took a deep, ragged breath. He realized that he had accepted the challenge not to be funny, but because somewhere deep inside, he wanted to be heard again. He stood up, put his cardigan back on, and walked out into the night air. The city was loud, but for the first time in a long time, Arthur didn't mind. He had a secret now. On Friday, the office would laugh, expecting a joke, but Arthur had something else to give them. He had the music. The next few days passed in a blur for Arthur. Usually, time moved slowly for him. measured by the ticking clock on the basement wall and the growing piles of mail. But now, with the Friday deadline hanging over his head, every hour seemed to slip away too fast. He went through the motions of his job, sorting letters and lifting boxes. But his mind was somewhere else entirely. Every time he walked past a group of employees chatting in the hallway, he felt a spike of anxiety. He was sure they were talking about him. He imagined them whispering, "Did you hear the mail guy signed up? It's going to be a disaster." He would pull the brim of his cap lower and walk faster, his eyes fixed on the floor. The simple challenge from Jessica had turned into a giant mountain he had to climb. Arthur knew he couldn't play well on a piano he hadn't touched. He needed to practice. He needed to remind his fingers how to dance across the keys again. So, on Wednesday morning, Arthur made a decision. He set his alarm clock for an hour earlier than usual. When the city outside his window was still dark gray and the streetlights were flickering off, he got up. He arrived at the office building while the streets were mostly empty. The security guard at the front desk, a heavy-set man named Bob, who was usually half asleep, looked up in surprise as Arthur trudged in. "You're here early." "Arthur," Bob said, taking a sip from his thermos. "Everything okay?" Arthur nodded, gripping the strap of his bag tight. "Yes, just have some extra work to catch up on. Thought I'd get a head start." It wasn't a total lie. He did have work, but that wasn't the real reason he was there. He waited for the elevator to take him up to the main floor. When the doors opened, the floor was silent. The cleaning crews had already finished their shifts, and the bright overhead lights were off, leaving the space lit only by the dim gray light coming through the giant glass windows. Arthur walked briskly across the expanse of the lobby. His footsteps echoed on the hard floor. Tap, tap, tap. It felt like walking into a church. The air was cool and still. There in the corner stood the piano. In the daylight, it looked neglected. The wood was scratched, and the black finish was dull. To the casual observer, it was just a piece of furniture gathering dust. But to Arthur, it looked like a sleeping beast waiting to be woken up. He pulled the chair out and sat down. He took off his coat and laid it over the back. He reached out and lifted the fallboard that covered the keys. The sound of the wood clicking against the piano frame was loud in the quiet room. He stared at the keys. They were yellowed with age, and some of them had small chips in the ivory. It was an old instrument, but Arthur hoped it still had a voice. Gently, he rested his fingers on the keys. He took a deep breath and pressed down. The sound that came out was jarring. A low C note buzzed and rattled. It was out of tune, sharp and piercing. Arthur flinched. He tried a chord higher up, and it sounded even worse. The notes clashed like angry neighbors. He stopped and looked around, feeling guilty, as if the piano might tell on him for hurting it. "This is going to be harder than I thought," he whispered to himself. He knew he couldn't fix the tuning with his hands. That took a professional. But he could figure out which keys were bad and try to work around them. He started to play a simple scale, going up and down the keyboard, listening carefully. He found that the middle octave was mostly okay, just a little rough on the edges. The high notes had a tinny, cheap sound, like bells made of plastic. The bass notes were muddy and unclear. He began to play a song he had known since he was a child. Gentle, flowing melody by a famous composer. He played slowly. His fingers were stiff and cold in the morning air. It felt like trying to type with thick winter gloves on. His brain knew where the fingers should go, but his hands were clumsy. They hesitated. He missed a note, then another. He stopped, shook his hands out, and tried again. For an hour, Arthur sat in the dim light, fighting with the piano and with himself. He played the same few bars over and over. Asterisk, wrong note. Stop. Try again. Missed the beat. Stop. Try again. Asterisk. It was frustrating. He felt a hot flush of embarrassment rise in his cheeks, even though no one was there to see him struggle. He felt foolish for thinking he could do this. Around 7:30 a.m., he heard the sound of a vacuum cleaner starting up in the hallway. The cleaning staff was returning for a final check. Arthur quickly slammed the keyboard lid shut. The loud bang echoed through the lobby. He He grabbed his coat and scrambled away from the piano, heading toward the safety of the stairwell that led down to the basement. He went back to his routine, but the music stayed in his head. He spent the rest of the day sorting mail with a newfound intensity. Every time he picked up an envelope, he imagined it was a musical note. He tapped rhythms on the edge of the sorting table with his fingernails. Asterisk 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Asterisk on Thursday morning, Arthur arrived early again. This time, he felt a little less scared. He walked straight to the piano and sat down. The air in the building felt different to daylighter somehow. He opened the lid and started to play. Today, he didn't care about the bad tuning as much. He focused on the feeling. He closed his eyes and let his hands find their way. He wasn't trying to be perfect. He was trying to remember who he used to be. He played the same gentle song, but this time he added a little bit of force. He let the melody swell. He tried to put emotion into the keys, pressing down harder to make the piano sing over its flaws. For a moment, he forgot he was in an office. He imagined he was back in a small concert hall, wearing a tuxedo, with the lights shining down on him. He was so lost in the music that he didn't hear the footsteps approaching. Arthur. The voice was soft and surprised. Arthur jumped. His hands jerked away from the keys, hitting a discordant cluster of notes that sounded like a crashing plate. He spun around on the bench. It was the young woman who organized the talent show. Jessica. She was standing there holding a coffee cup, wearing a gym outfit. She looked tired, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was staring at him with her mouth slightly open. Arthur felt his face turn bright red. He stood up quickly, knocking the bench back. I was just... he stammered. He couldn't find the words. I was just checking if it works. For the show? Jessica took a step closer. I didn't know you could play like that. Arthur looked down at his shoes. I used to. A long time ago. It's not very good. The piano is out of tune. It sounded beautiful, she said. Her voice was quiet, but she sounded serious. She wasn't laughing. I heard it from the elevators. I thought it was the radio. Arthur didn't know what to say. He mumbled something about getting back to work and grabbed his coat. Wait, Jessica said. Friday at 4 p.m. Don't forget. And Arthur? He paused at the edge of the lobby near the elevators. Whatever you were playing just now, play that. Arthur gave a small, awkward nod and stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, he let out a long breath he didn't know he was holding. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. She hadn't laughed. That was something. On Thursday night, Arthur couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the dusty lobby piano. He thought about Jessica's face. He thought about the hundreds of people who would be staring at him on Friday. Fear gripped his stomach like a tight fist. He got out of bed and walked to his small kitchen. He opened a drawer and took out an old photograph. It was wrinkled and faded. It showed a younger version of himself sitting at a grand piano, smiling at the camera. A woman was standing next to him. Her hand on his shoulder, Arthur traced the outline of the piano keys in the photo with his thumb. I can do this, he whispered to the quiet room. I can do this for you. He went back to bed, but he didn't sleep much. He just listened to the ticking of the clock, counting down the minutes until he had to face the music. Friday morning arrived with a brightness that felt mocking to Arthur. He woke up before his alarm, his stomach churning with a mix of dread and nervous energy. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, looking at his hands. They were the hands of an old man, skin spotted with age, knuckles slightly swollen from years of physical work. They were not the hands of a concert pianist anymore. He flexed his fingers, trying to loosen the stiffness, but the anxiety made his joints feel tight. He got dressed slowly. He chose his best white shirt and made sure the buttons were all done up correctly. He put on his gray trousers and made sure they were pressed. He looked in the mirror and sighed. He still looked like Arthur, the male guy. He didn't look like a musician. He didn't look like someone who belonged on a stage. When he arrived at the office, the atmosphere was already buzzing. The company's family day was in full swing. The main floor was decorated with colorful streamers and balloons. There were tables piled high with donuts, bagels, and coffee. The The smell of sugar and pastry filled the air, mixing with the usual scent of cleaning products. Arthur tried to slip through the lobby unnoticed. He kept his head down, clutching his lunch bag tightly. He wanted to get to the safety of the basement mailroom before anyone saw him. But the office was more crowded than usual. People were milling about, visiting from other floors, grabbing breakfast before the meeting started, just as he was nearing the elevators. A group of younger employees from the marketing department walked by. They were laughing loudly. One of them, a tall man named David, spotted Arthur. "Hey, look who it is," David called out, grinning. "The star of the show?" Arthur stopped. He felt his face get hot. "Please," he mumbled, trying to keep walking. "I am just going to work." "Come on, Arthur, don't be shy." Another woman chimed in. She was holding a cup of coffee and looked excited. "We heard you signed up for the talent show." "That is so brave." "Are you going to play a funny song?" "Like, maybe you'll wear a funny hat." The group laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, really. It was the laugh of people who didn't know any better. To them, Arthur was a source of amusement. They were expecting a comedy act. They were waiting for the quiet old man to do something silly so they could have a good chuckle before the weekend started. "I just play," a little Arthur said quietly. He looked at the elevator button, praying it would light up. "Maybe you'll play chopsticks with your nose," David joked. That would be viral video gold. The group roared with laughter. Arthur felt a sharp pain in his chest. It wasn't a heart attack, but it hurt all the same. It was the feeling of being unseen, of being reduced to a caricature. He forced a tight, uncomfortable smile and nodded at them. "We will see," he said. The elevator doors finally opened. Arthur stepped inside quickly and pressed the button for the basement repeatedly. As the doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of their laughter, he leaned his head against the cold metal wall. He squeezed his eyes shut. He felt like a fraud. They wanted a clown. He was about to give them a ghost. Down in the mailroom, it was chaos. Because of the festivities upstairs, the workload had doubled. Everyone was sending gifts and packages to clients. There were stacks of boxes everywhere. Arthur dived into his work, grateful for the distraction. He moved boxes, hefted heavy sacks, and typed out labels furiously. The physical exertion helped burn off some of his nervous energy. But the knot in his stomach remained. Around lunchtime, the rumors started to filter down to the basement. Tim, the young man who worked the scanner, came over to where Arthur was sorting a pile of letters. "Hey, Arthur," Tim said, leaning in conspiratorially. "People are really talking about you upstairs." "Are they?" "Yeah, everyone is making bets," Tim said, looking a bit awkward. "The pool in the break room has $50 in it already." "What are they betting on?" Arthur asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Most people bet that you're going to freeze up and run off stage," Tim admitted. "A few people think you're going to break a piano string. Some think you're going to play a nursery rhyme." Tim paused. I didn't put any money down. I didn't think it was right." Arthur looked at the young man. Tim's face was sincere. "Thank you, Tim," Arthur said softly. "That is kind of you." "I just hope you don't get humiliated, Arthur," Tim said, patting him on the shoulder. "Those guys upstairs can be ruthless." Arthur nodded. He went back to his letters, but his hands were shaking slightly. He felt like he was walking toward a cliff edge. The expectation of failure was heavy. It pressed down on him like a physical weight. He remembered the feeling he had in the basement as a child. The fear of reciting a poem in front of the class and forgetting the words. That feeling of being small and exposed had never really left him. At 2 p.m., Jessica came down to the mailroom. She looked frantic. She was carrying a clipboard and a headset. "Arthur." "There you are," she said, breathless. "We are doing the sound check. I need you to come up and test the microphone." Arthur felt his legs turn to jelly now. "I still have work to do." "Forget the work." Jessica waved her hand dismissively. "You are in the show. That is your priority right now. Come on." Arthur looked around the mailroom. His supervisor gave him a thumbs up. "Go ahead, Arthur. We can cover for you." Slowly, Arthur took off his apron and hung it on the hook. He washed his hands in the small sink, drying them carefully on a paper towel. He smoothed down his shirt. He followed Jessica out of the basement and up to the main floor. The lobby had been transformed. The chairs where people usually sat waiting for meetings had been pushed back to create a large open space. A temporary stage had been set up near the glass wall. It wasn't a high stage, just a flat platform raised about 6 inches off the ground. But to Arthur, it looked like a mountain. The piano had been moved from the corner to the center of the stage. Under the bright lights, the scratches and dust were hidden. It looked almost majestic. A man with a long beard and a soundboard was testing the microphones. Testing. 1, 2. Testing. Jessica led Arthur onto the stage. "Okay," she said, her voice all business. "Sit at the piano. I want to check the levels for the instrument." Arthur walked up the 2 small steps. He felt the eyes of the sound crew on him. He sat down on the bench. It felt higher than usual. He felt exposed. The open space of the lobby stretched out in front of him, vast and intimidating. "Play something," the sound guy said. "Just a few notes." Arthur placed his hands on the keys. The lights were shining in his eyes, making it hard to see the audience area clearly. He pressed a chord. The sound guy nodded and twisted some knobs. "Again," he said. Arthur played a scale. His fingers felt stiff. He felt sweat gathering on his forehead. He felt incredibly small and foolish. Here he was, an old man in a gray cardigan, sitting on a stage in a modern office building, pretending to be a performer. "Okay, that sounds good," the sound guy said after a minute. "You're good to go." Arthur stood up quickly. "Can I go back downstairs now?" He asked Jessica. She looked at him. She saw the terror in his eyes. She softened a little. "Sure. Just be back here at 3:45 p.m. We go on at 4 p.m. sharp." Arthur retreated. He went back to the basement, but he couldn't work anymore. He just sat on a crate in the corner and watched the clock tick. 3:40 p.m., 3:45. The mailroom was quiet now. Most of the staff had gone upstairs to watch the show or grab snacks. Arthur stood up. He took a deep breath. He felt like he was walking to the electric chair. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. As he ascended, he closed his eyes and thought about the song. He wasn't playing a comedy act. He wasn't playing chopsticks. He was playing a piece of music that was about loss and about holding on. It was a letter to his past, a letter he had been carrying for 30 years. It was the only thing he had left that was real. The elevator dinged. The doors opened. The roar of the crowd hit him immediately. He stepped out, ready to face them. The noise hit him like a solid wall. Stepping out of the elevator, Arthur felt the vibrations of hundreds of voices. Mingling with the clatter of chairs and the thumping bass of pop music playing over the speakers, the main floor of the office had been completely transformed. The cubicles were hidden behind partitions, and the center of the room was a sea of round tables covered in white cloths. Every seat was filled. Waiters weaved through the crowd, carrying trays of fancy drinks and appetizers. Arthur stood near the elevators, feeling incredibly small in his gray cardigan. He clutched the strap of his bag tighter, even though he didn't need it. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at a stormy ocean. These were his coworkers, people he saw every day. But tonight, they looked different. They were dressed in bright colors, laughing loudly, their faces glowing under the warm party lights. They were excited. They were waiting for a show. He scanned the room, looking for a place to hide. He spotted Tim near the back, standing with a group of other young men from the shipping department. Tim caught his eye and gave him a nervous thumbs up. Arthur tried to smile back, but his lips felt frozen. He saw Jessica near the stage, frantically speaking into a headset. He saw the man named David, who had made fun of him earlier. David was sitting near the front, a drink in his hand, leaning back in his chair as if he owned the place. "All right, everyone. Please take your seats." A voice boomed over the loudspeaker. It was the company's CEO, a man named Mr. Sterling. He was standing on the stage with a microphone in his hand. "Welcome to our annual Family Day talent show. We have a great lineup for you today. Let's give it up for our first act." The room erupted in applause. A group of women from the accounting department ran onto the stage wearing glittery headbands. They began a synchronized dance routine to a popular pop song. The crowd cheered and whistled. Arthur watched from the shadows. It felt surreal. He felt like he was watching a movie, not standing in his own workplace. One by one, the acts went by. There was a man who juggled apples and dropped one, causing the crowd to laugh good-naturedly. There was a young woman who sang a ballad but forgot the words halfway through, turning bright red. There was a magician who pulled coins out of people's ears. With every act that passed, Arthur felt his heart beat faster. It was like a ticking clock in his chest. The air in the room felt thick and hard to breathe. He wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers. He felt the urge to run. He could just turn around, get back in the elevator and go home. He could say he felt sick. No one would blame him. They would probably be relieved they didn't have to watch the old male guy fumble around on the piano. But then he remembered the feeling of the keys under his fingers that morning. He remembered the sound of the music echoing in the empty lobby. And he remembered the promise he had made to himself in the dark of his bedroom. He wasn't doing this for them. He was doing this for the ghost of who he used to be. And now the CEO's voice rang out, interrupting Arthur's thoughts. For our final act before the judging panel makes their decision, this is a surprise entry. From the mailroom? Please welcome, Arthur. The applause was polite but sparse. It was the kind of clapping people do when they don't know what to expect. A few people whispered to their neighbors. David laughed loudly near the front. This ought to be good, Arthur heard him say, even from across the room. Arthur felt his legs move as if on their own. He walked out from the side of the room. The walk to the stage felt like the longest journey of his life. Every step felt heavy, like he was walking through deep mud. The lights were bright in his eyes. He couldn't see faces anymore, just a blur of shapes and colors. He climbed the 2 steps onto the platform. The piano sat there, waiting for him. It looked smaller on stage than it did in the corner. He walked over to the bench and sat down. He adjusted his glasses. He looked out at the crowd. All he could see was a wall of darkness. The silence was heavy. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was an anxious, waiting silence. Hundreds of people were holding their breath, waiting for the joke to start. Arthur reached out and placed his hands on the keys. They were cold. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the air that smelled of perfume and food. He closed his eyes. He didn't start with a bang. He didn't start with a goofy tune. He pressed down on the keys gently, playing a single, low note. It hummed through the speakers, deep and resonant. Then his left hand began to move. It was a slow, steady rhythm. A heartbeat. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. A moment later, his right hand joined in. The melody began to creep out. It was not fast. It was not happy. It was a piece by a composer who had known sorrow. The notes were clear and sharp. They floated over the heads of the audience. For the first 10 seconds, the room stayed perfectly still. Someone coughed in the back. A glass clinked on a table. The whispering stopped. Then, Arthur's hands began to move faster. He wasn't reading music. He didn't have any sheets in front of him. He was playing from memory. He felt the muscles in his arms wake up. The stiffness that had plagued him in the practice sessions melted away, replaced by a fluid grace he hadn't felt in decades. The music grew louder. It wasn't just sound. It was a story. It was a story of loss and loneliness. It was the sound of a person crying out in the dark, then finding the strength to stand up. Arthur's hands were a blur. He hit the keys with a force that surprised even him. He wasn't the gentle mailman anymore. He was a master of his craft. He poured 30 years of silence into the piano. He poured in the grief of losing his wife. He poured in the loneliness of eating lunch alone on a park bench. He poured in the feeling of being invisible. The people in the audience were frozen. The man who had been juggling apples stopped eating his. The woman who had forgotten the lyrics of her song opened her mouth slightly. David, who had been laughing, set his drink down on the table. He stared at the stage, his face blank with shock. This wasn't chopsticks. This wasn't a joke. Arthur's fingers danced across the yellowed keys. He found the bad notes, the ones that were out of tune. and he played them in a way that made them sound intentional, like a cry of pain. He was wrestling with the instrument, demanding it give him everything it had. The sound swelled to a climax. It was a roar of emotion that filled the entire hall. The vibrations shook the floor of the stage. Arthur was sweating now. His gray hair was damp. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, but he didn't stop. He was running toward the finish line, and then, just as the music reached its peak, it stopped. Arthur lifted his hands off the keys in one sharp motion. The final chord hung in the air, echoing off the glass walls of the building. Then there was silence. Not the polite silence from before. This was a heavy, shocked silence. No one moved. No one spoke. You couldn't hear a single cough or a single whisper. It was as if the entire room had ceased to exist. Leaving only the ghost of the music vibrating in their ears, Arthur sat on the bench, his chest heaving up and down. He looked at his hands resting in his lap. They were trembling violently. He slowly opened his eyes, blinking against the bright lights. He couldn't see the crowd, but he could feel them. He could feel the change in the air. The indifference was gone. The mockery was gone. In its place was something he hadn't felt in 30 years. Respect. Arthur sat there for one more moment, letting the silence wash over him. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He just stood up, pushing the bench back with a scrape. He turned and walked off the stage, moving quickly into the shadows, leaving the crowd stunned behind him. The silence stretched out, heavy and thick, like a blanket that covered the entire room. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the music had reached inside every person there and turned off their ability to make noise. Even the waiters stood frozen, their trays held suspended in mid-dash air. Arthur stood in the wings of the stage, just outside the bright circle of light. His chest was heaving, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, the fingers tingling as if they were touching live wires. He felt dizzy, a rush of adrenaline flooding his system that made his knees feel weak. For a moment, he thought they were angry. He thought the silence meant they hated it. He thought he had made a fool of himself after all. He tightened his grip on the strap of his bag, preparing to run away, to leave the building and never come back. Then a sound broke the quiet. It started near the front. A single man stood up. It was the CEO, Mr. Sterling. He slowly began to clap. His hands came together with a steady, heavy rhythm. Then another person joined in. Then another. Suddenly, the silence shattered. The room exploded into sound. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a roar. It was a wave of noise that crashed against the walls. People stood up from their tables. Some were cheering. Others were whistling. A few women were wiping tears from their eyes with napkins. Arthur flinched at the sudden noise. He looked out at the crowd, blinking in confusion. He saw faces that were usually blank or bored, now glowing with emotion. He saw the man named David, the one who had made fun of him. David was standing too, clapping hard, his mouth slightly open, looking completely stunned. He looked as if he had just seen a ghost, or perhaps as if he had just seen a miracle for the first time. The energy in the room was electric. It hit Arthur like a physical force. He felt a strange sensation in his own chest, loosening. A release of the tight knot that had lived there for 30 years. He realized they weren't laughing. They were moved. They had seen him. Not the mailroom guy. Not the old man in the cardigan. They had seen him. Jessica ran up to him, her eyes wide. She grabbed his arm, beaming. Arthur. That was. I don't even have words. That was incredible. You have to go back out there. They want an encore. Arthur shook his head quickly, pulling his arm away gently. No, he said. His voice was raspy. No, I can't. Please, just one more song. She begged. I have given what I have, Arthur said softly. He looked at her with an intensity that made her stop. I have nothing left to give tonight. He didn't wait for her to answer. He didn't look at the crowd. He turned and walked quickly toward the exit door at the side of the hall. He pushed the metal bar down and stepped out into the cool hallway. The roar of the applause followed him for a moment, then faded as the heavy door swung shut behind him. Arthur leaned against the wall in the empty corridor. He let out a long, ragged breath. He looked down at his hands again. They were still trembling, but they didn't look like useless old hands anymore. They looked like they had done something important. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the basement. He needed to get his coat. He needed to go home. When he walked into the mailroom, it was quiet. The lights were dimmed because the shift was technically over. But he wasn't alone. Tim was there, sitting on a crate, waiting for him. A few other guys from the shipping department were there too. They were talking in low whispers, but they stopped as soon as Arthur walked in. The room was awkward for a second. No one knew what to say. Then, Tim stood up. He walked over to Arthur and extended his hand. "Arthur," Tim said, his voice serious. "We heard it from down here. The speakers are connected to the PA system." He shook his head slowly. "I had no idea. I mean, we all knew you were quiet, but we didn't know you were that." "That was beautiful, Arthur," another man chimed in from the back. "Really?" Arthur looked at Tim's hand. It was a young hand, strong and rough. Arthur reached out and took it. The handshake was firm. "Thank you, Tim," Arthur whispered. He felt a lump forming in his throat, blocking his words. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that from his peers. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Tim asked. "You could have been playing at parties or weddings. You know, earning real money." Arthur smiled a little. It was a sad, small smile. "I didn't play for money," Arthur said. "I played because I had to. And then, for a long time, I stopped playing because it hurt too much. Today, I just wanted to see if I still could." "Well, you still can," Tim said firmly. "You definitely still can." Arthur nodded. He walked to his locker, took out his coat and his old hat, and put them on. He said goodbye to the men. He didn't stay to chat. He wasn't ready to be the center of attention. He needed to be alone again. He walked out of the building through the side exit. The night air was cool and crisp. The city was alive, cars driving by with their headlights cutting through the dark, people walking home from the bars and restaurants. Arthur walked down the street toward the bus stop. His legs felt lighter than they had in years. The heavy weight of his daily routine, the feeling of being invisible and unimportant, seemed to have lifted off his shoulders. He wasn't just Arthur the mail clerk anymore. He was Arthur the musician. He thought about the piano sitting on the stage in the lobby. He thought about the dust that would settle on it again tomorrow. He thought about how people would pass by it, and maybe, just maybe, they would look at it differently now. He reached the bus stop just as his bus was pulling up. He climbed on, paid his fare, and took a seat near the window. He watched the city pass by. The streetlights blurred into streaks of gold and white. Arthur reached into his pocket and felt the folded photograph of his wife. He didn't take it out this time. He just rubbed his thumb over the fabric of his pocket. "I did it," he whispered to the empty air of the bus. "I finally played for them." He rested his head against the cold glass of the window. He was tired, exhausted to his bones. But for the first time in 30 years, his mind was peaceful. The music was gone from the air, but it was still playing inside him, a quiet, steady melody that no one could silence. He knew that tomorrow he would go back to sorting mail. He would still wear his gray cardigan. He would still eat his lunch alone on the bench. But something had changed. The world hadn't changed, but he had. He knew now that he wasn't just a background character in someone else's story. He had a voice. And even if he only used it once every 30 years, it was a voice that could shake the world. Arthur closed his eyes as the bus rumbled on, carrying him home. The silence in his own head was no longer lonely. It was full.